The water flooded my orchard. Thick, chemical-laced runoff surged down the hill like a river of poison drowning my trees. I ran heart-pounding as the smell of chlorine filled the air. My father's legacy was being destroyed. I looked up. There she was. Karen, standing on her porch watching it all, a smile playing on her lips. "You'll understand soon enough," she said, as if this was all part of her plan. I wanted to scream, but I knew this wasn't an accident. She was making sure my orchard, my future was ruined. But what she didn't know, I was ready to fight back. And this was just the beginning. Karen had always been trouble. The first time I saw her, she was strutting across the neighborhood barbecue, her bright pink blazer almost glowing in the sun. She wasn't just a member of the HOA. No, she was the HOA, a self-appointed queen who made sure everyone knew it. She spoke loudly about community standards, her words sharp like each one was a command. I remember the way she eyed my orchard like it was something to be tamed. When she first sent me that notice about visual inconsistencies, I laughed. My orchard had been here long before any of her HOA nonsense. But Karen didn't back down. She made sure the rules were followed no matter who got hurt. And I wasn't one of her subjects. My land was sacred. She hated that. Karen didn't just break rules, she made them, twisted them. And she had a habit of turning everything to her advantage. She didn't care about my orchard or my family's history. To her, I was just an obstacle, something to bulldoze over in the name of progress. That day she told me, "The community comes first." I realized something. Karen wasn't just trying to control my land. She was trying to erase everything it stood for. And she wasn't going to stop until I was out of the way. The weeks dragged on each one, adding a layer of pressure. Karen's pond grew bigger, more elaborate, but I could feel something else growing too, something that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just about an eyesore or a community improvement. This was a calculated move to destroy what I had built. It started with small jabs. First came the letters, a friendly reminder from the HOA about the need for aesthetic consistency in the community. My orchard apparently didn't fit the picture. Karen's passive-aggressive tone was clear in every line. Visual inconsistency with the neighborhood standards. I'd laugh it off, knowing full well she had no right to even send these letters. My orchard predated the HOA by decades. But Karen didn't stop there. She began pushing further, demanding I repaint my shed to match HOA-approved colors. My shed was red, a barn red that had been the same since the 82nds. But to Karen it was a violation of community design. It wasn't just the shed, it was my whole way of life, the things I'd built with sweat and care. I couldn't help but laugh, but it wasn't funny. It was harassment. She was testing me inch by inch to see how far she could push, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. It wasn't long before I noticed the contractors. I was walking back from the barn one day when I spotted two men standing at the edge of my property, tape measures in hand, eyes glued to a tablet. They were surveying. At first I assumed they were lost, but the moment I approached, one of them stiffened. "We're conducting a community project assessment," the older man said, his voice shaky. My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly who had sent them. "Do you have any paperwork with my signature on it?" I asked, my voice low and sharp. He stammered, glancing at his partner who looked just as uncomfortable. "No," he muttered. I nodded, stepping closer. "Then get off my land." They backed up, but not before snapping photos of the boundary. I caught the flash, the unmistakable sound of a camera. They had no business being here, but I had no doubt it was Karen's doing. This was more than an innocent survey. They were marking out a future project, her project. I could feel it in my gut. Things started escalating fast after that. Trucks rolled up with supplies, dumping rocks and dirt. The pond was taking shape. I watched in horror as Karen strutted around overseeing the work like a queen. She kept her distance from me, but I noticed the sly glances she threw my way. It was only when the pipes started going in that I realized just how deep her plan ran. One afternoon, I hiked up to see the pond's progress. That's when I saw the outflow pipe. It was aimed directly at my orchard. I knew what it meant. A pipe buried in the soil like a hidden weapon waiting to unleash chemicals into my land. The flow was subtle at first, just a few drops leaking out of the pipe's mouth, but I could already see the damage. The soil was slick, unnatural. This wasn't just rainwater. It wasn't just runoff. It was contaminated chlorine-heavy water from Karen's pond washing down the slope toward my trees. I rushed down the hill, feeling my heart pound in my chest. The trees were already reacting. The leaves at the bottom were turning a sickly yellow. Some were curling at the edges. I crouched down, touched the soil. It felt wrong. The texture, the smell, everything. My orchard, the land my father had worked, the trees he'd planted with his own hands, was being poisoned. This was no accident. It was sabotage. And Karen, I knew, was behind it. At first, I tried reasoning with her. I confronted her on the hill that afternoon just as she was posing for a photo overseeing her masterpiece. She looked at me like I was a nuisance, a fly buzzing around her head. "Mike, you're being dramatic." "It's just water," she said dismissively. I didn't buy it. I explained that the water coming from the pond was chemically treated chlorine-heavy and dangerous. Her response was colder than the wind blowing across the hill. "Mike, the community needs this. This is progress." She brushed me off like I was nothing. A few days later, I received a notice from the HOA, an official complaint. Karen had filed a false report, claiming that I was obstructing her project, that my trees were somehow a hazard to the community's vision. It was absurd. The authorities showed up, the police no less, to investigate. I tried to stay calm, but every word from Karen's mouth felt like a slap. She was using her power to manipulate the system, to make me look like the villain. "Mike," she said with a smirk, "maybe you should start following community guidelines. The rules are for everyone." I resisted the urge to shout. Instead, I walked away, my fists clenched, knowing she was playing a dangerous game. I wasn't going to let her win. And then came the rain. The storm hit like a freight train, heavy and unforgiving. I knew it was coming. I grabbed my boots, my flashlight, and raced to the orchard. The runoff would be overwhelming, and I needed to see it for myself. As I stood at the edge of my property, the sound of rushing water filled my ears. But it wasn't just rainwater. The pipe burst open, spewing toxic runoff straight into the orchard. The water gushed like a river of poison cutting through the soil, tearing up the earth. I stood frozen watching as it swirled around my trees. It wasn't an accident. This was exactly what Karen had planned. Her pond, her project, was a weapon. And it was destroying everything I'd worked for. I raced down the slope, the water rushing past me, feeling the anger rising in my chest. "This is war, Karen," I muttered to myself. "You just made it personal." Layer 1, public confrontation. The HOA's community improvement event was supposed to be Karen's shining moment, a chance for her to parade around like a queen, showing off her project as if it were some grand accomplishment. But I had other plans. I watched from the orchard as the guests trickled in, chatting and admiring the new pond, completely oblivious to the poison it had poured into my land. Karen was in her element, waving her hands, explaining how the pond was a natural feature and how it would improve property values. She even tried to give me a polite wave from across the hill. But I didn't wave back. I stood by my trees, arms crossed, watching the show. The moment Karen stepped onto her terrace, I made my move. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked one guest, grinning from ear to ear. But then they all turned toward the bottom of the hill. The signs I'd placed at the edge of my orchard were impossible to ignore. Orchard contaminated by HOA drainage. Evidence being documented for legal action. The guests stopped in their tracks, confusion spreading across their faces. I didn't wait for anyone to ask questions. I walked forward casually, picking up the pruning shears and starting to trim a sick tree in plain view. A woman at the railing squinted, pointing. "Is that the orchard Karen mentioned? The organic one?" Karen froze. The smile that had been plastered on her face flickered, then faded. "This isn't relevant to the tour," Karen said, her voice tight, her hands clasping her clipboard so hard I thought it might snap. But curiosity is a powerful thing. More guests gathered by the edge, leaning over the rail, muttering about the signs, whispering about the orchard's condition. They wanted to know more. "Why does it say contaminated?" someone asked. I didn't hesitate. "Because it is," I said, my voice carrying up the slope. "Your runoff is poisoning my orchard." Karen's face turned crimson. "This is a misunderstanding," she snapped, but the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. "Is this true?" a man asked, voice laced with skepticism. "Chlorine in your orchard?" I pulled out one of the lab reports from my bag, holding it up for everyone to see. The numbers were damning. 3.2 parts per million of chlorine in the runoff, enough to destroy organic soil, enough to ruin everything I'd worked for. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others frowning. It was clear now Karen's project wasn't just a simple miscommunication. It was a crime against my land. "You don't understand," Karen said, desperation creeping into her voice. "This is all eco-friendly. The HOA approved it. Everything was legal, but it wasn't safe," I said, stepping forward, my voice steady. "And you knew it. You deliberately ignored the risks to save money and speed up your timeline." Her eyes widened. "That's not—" "I have all the documentation," I interrupted. "Emails, permits, lab results. You were warned, and you chose to ignore it?" A few guests stepped closer, snapping photos of the report, the water-soaked trees, the poisoned soil. Someone in the crowd even pulled out a phone to record. Karen's empire of lies was crumbling in real time, and there was no way to stop it now. The HOA board members finally showed up, trailing behind Karen, looking like they were attending a funeral. West and Laura, none of them met my gaze. They'd heard enough by now to know what was happening. The architect, who had been so enthusiastic about Karen's pond earlier, turned to her with a cold expression. "That liner," he said, pointing at the commercial-grade material, "doesn't have any filtration system. And that outflow pipe, it's a disaster waiting to happen." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes flickered with panic. "That's not true," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "The HOA followed all the rules. This project is perfectly legal." But her voice was shaking now. Laura, who had been standing behind Karen, stepped forward looking torn. "Karen," she said softly, "we didn't know about the risks. The board didn't sign off on this. Not like this." Karen's face twisted in fury. "You're all turning against me," she spat. "You think I did this on purpose?" I crossed my arms, finally speaking the truth that had been buried beneath layers of her lies. "You didn't just ignore the risks, Karen. You created them. You poisoned my orchard for your vanity project, and now it's all coming apart." The crowd was silent, watching the fallout unfold before their eyes. The board members stood awkwardly, caught between the truth and their loyalty to Karen. But it was clear her empire was crumbling. Then the final blow, the architect turned to the group and said, "We need to look into this further. This isn't just a mistake. This is negligence." The word hung in the air like a sword over Karen's head. The dust had barely settled from the confrontation when I stood at the edge of the orchard, looking at what was left. The trees were damaged, their once pristine leaves now curled and yellowed the ground, soggy and unyielding. But I wasn't thinking about the damage anymore. I was thinking about the community. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The neighbors who had once whispered about the pond's beauty were now turning their backs on Karen. The signs I'd placed in the orchard weren't just warnings. They were invitations to stand up for what was right. People came by offering help, mulch, compost, even their time to replant. They had seen the truth, and now they were standing with me. For the first time, I felt what my father must have felt all those years ago, planting the first trees. This orchard was more than just land. It was a legacy, and it wasn't just mine to protect anymore. The community, once so silent, was starting to speak up. They were fighting for what mattered. The next day, Karen's board was in disarray. After the public humiliation, they couldn't defend her. Within hours, the HOA had sent me a formal apology, admitting the errors in their project and the damage caused. They offered me a settlement of $380,000 for crop losses, soil remediation, recertification costs, and legal fees. But that wasn't all. The county had already started investigating the pond for its improper drainage, and with the evidence I had gathered, the project would be dismantled. The toxic outflow pipe was going to be removed and replaced with a proper filtration system, one that wouldn't poison my land. The HOA agreed to foot the bill for the new drainage system and cover the entire cost of my orchard's recovery. Karen, on the other hand, was left with nothing. No position of power, no control, just a sinking reputation and a pile of legal troubles. The community had spoken, and it wasn't in her favor. Weeks passed, and things slowly started to heal. The trees began to recover, their leaves turning green again, the soil no longer slick with poison. The orchard was coming back to life, and with it the trust that had been lost in the process. Karen disappeared from the community. The once proud president of the HOA was nowhere to be found. I'd heard whispers about her being removed from her position, but no one had seen her since. It was as if the community had erased her just as easily as she had tried to erase me. Then one day, as I was walking the rows of the orchard, I saw her at the ridge. She stood there, staring at the workers who were dismantling her pond, watching her empire fall apart. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. I didn't need to. The orchard had spoken for itself, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The legal battle had been won, the orchard was saved, but more than that, I'd learned something. No matter how powerful someone seems, no matter how much they try to control your life, they can't erase what's real. And what's real is the truth, the soil, and the legacy of hard work that no one can take away. As the sun set over the orchard, I walked down the hill with a smile on my face. My father's trees were still standing tall, and I knew I'd keep standing tall too, no matter what came next.